Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about the outcome of the Chicago mayoral primary, litigation against Illinois' gun ban, and happenings at the Illinois State House. I'll then join the Center Square executive editor Dan McCaleb to further discuss the news. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Hello, I'm Katherine Mintzer, a family farmer raising corn and soybeans in Christian County, Illinois. It might be hard to believe, but 96% of the farms in Illinois are owned and operated by family farmers just like me. Our job is to grow the healthiest, most affordable food around to feed my family and yours. Meet more farmers just like me at www.watchusgrow.org/corn.
A message from the Illinois Corn Marketing Board.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Here's some of the top stories from the past week. Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot conceded in her race for mayor Tuesday after former Chicago Public Schools CEO Paul Vallas and Cook County Commissioner Brandon Johnson will head off to the April 4th runoff election to determine her successor. Andrew Hensel has that story.
Vallas held a healthy lead with more than 95% of precincts reporting, receiving 34% of the votes counted. Since no candidate received 50% of the vote, the election will go to a runoff between Vallas and Johnson. Vallas spoke to supporters Tuesday night.
I've had success because I've always had the good sense to listen to the community, to empower the community, and draw my leadership from the community.
Lightfoot also conceded late Tuesday.
I've called Brandon Johnson and Paul Vallas to congratulate them on their victories and advancing to the runoffs.
Johnson spoke last Tuesday and said that he wants to make Chicago a place that truly invests in its people. 6 other candidates were also eliminated from contention, including Congressman Chuy Garcia. I'm Andrew Hensel.
Meanwhile, Governor J.B. Pritzker's not ready to endorse a candidate in the Chicago mayoral race. Kevin Bessler has more.
Former Chicago Schools CEO Paul Vallas garnered 34% of the vote, followed by Cook County Commissioner Brandon Johnson with 20%. Vallas' main campaign message centered on public safety.
And it is the principal responsibility of government. And we will have a safe Chicago. We will make Chicago the safest city in America.
During an appearance in Springfield, Pritzker said the primary didn't allow the candidates to express their views on the issues, so he is not ready to endorse a candidate.
I'm a Chicago voter, so I'm going to be listening intently to what they have to say, and I look forward to watching and listening to the campaign play out.
Vallas and Johnson will compete in a runoff April 4th. Mayor Lori Lightfoot, who came in third place, is the first incumbent in Chicago to not be reelected in 40 years. I'm Kevin Bessler.
In their response to the plaintiffs' group suing to block Illinois' gun ban and registry, the state argues the law is constitutional and restricts dangerous weapons. The argument filed Thursday in federal court gives examples of previous lower court rulings on gun restrictions and points to 8 other states with similar bans, while noting last year's U.S. Supreme Court ruling, referred to as the Bruin decision, clarified the analytical framework courts use when handling the Second Amendment cases. The state said the ruling did not say the ultimate conclusions of previous decisions were wrong. With more filings expected before a hearing April 12th in federal court, gun rights advocate Todd Vandermeide said gun owners need the law blocked.
I think getting an injunction, one, turns us back to a pre-January 9th status. I mean, these firearms have been legal for sale in Illinois for decades.
The state argues modern firearms were not in common use when the Second Amendment was ratified in 1788, and the state's law looks to address dramatic technological changes that created weapons beyond self-defense. Vandermeide predicts the state's arguments won't stand.
You apply what they want to the First Amendment, and the internet, radio, television, Twitter, all the like don't obtain First Amendment protections.
Among the stack of pages in the state's filing are illustrations, pages of statistical analysis, and more, making the case against the court blocking the law. Vandermeide said that's irrelevant.
They put in something that's like 100 pages of news clippings about Highland Park. It's not really relevant to the test at hand.
In other pages are declarations from consultants costing taxpayers hundreds of dollars each. One consultant is charging up to $750 an hour, while another charges $1,600 a day to travel and provide testimony. Members of a House committee took issue with the hiring process of the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services. Kevin Bessler has details.
During a House Adoption and Child Welfare Committee hearing Tuesday, lawmakers were told that First Central Management Services screens candidates before DCFS goes through a similar process. Raven Devon is with CMS.
While we have still seen a reduction in overall time to hire since going electronic, our best estimate is the full process is taking approximately 108 days today.
State Representative Mary Flowers says DCFS is losing good people because of the complicated hiring process.
Rethink whatever it is that you're doing here, because this reminds me of a clogged sink, and when the stuff backs up, it stinks.
The agency has been under fire in recent months. A report by an inspector general showed 171 children died while in contact with the department in 2022, 40% more than the year before. I'm Kevin Bessler.
And those are the top stories from the past week from Illinois. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square executive editor Dan McCaleb. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Freedom and liberty are important to all of us in Illinois, from Rockford to Carbondale, from Quincy to Decatur. If you're looking for civil, intellectual conversations with those shaping the future of freedom, try the Future of Freedom podcast with me, Scott Bertram. We speak with leaders across the country in the greater conservative and libertarian movements. In-depth conversations about where the next intellectual battles will happen across the country. It's the Future of Freedom podcast. Find it at americastalking.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello and welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Dan McCaleb, executive editor of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me today is Greg Bishop, the Center Square's Illinois editor and senior Capitol reporter. How are you doing, Greg?
I'm good, Dan. I'm actually on the second floor of the Capitol right now, looking at some pretty incredible carvings in a windowsill that the oldest date I've seen is 1918.
Wow.
Chaz L.H. on January 22nd, 1918, carving into a piece of marble here. It's pretty incredible.
Interesting. Why don't we get right into it? There was a pretty big election this week, and Chicago is going to have a new mayor after it. In Tuesday's primary, Mayor Lori Lightfoot finished in third place behind former Chicago Public Schools Chief Paul Vallas and Cook County Commissioner and Chicago Teachers Union operative Brandon Johnson. While there are still outstanding votes to be counted, their leads seem significant enough that they will advance to the April 4th runoff. Any insights here?
Yeah, and this is the first time that in several decades an incumbent Chicago mayor has lost re-election. And when you have a flood of 9 different candidates in a primary, you can see how the votes can easily get split up. But with the ongoing month or so left here before the April 4th runoff election, there's going to be a lot of voters in Chicago looking at Brandon Johnson and Paul Vallas as to what are they going to do for the city. This after 4 years of Lori Lightfoot. Everything from issues around education to crime to the COVID pandemic. You can go back and check the tape on all of the various controversies she had, including selecting which race of journalists she would have one-on-one conversations with. So Lori Lightfoot had a lot of controversy that she had to answer to on election day, and coming in third, she's on her way out, making way for Paul Vallas and Brandon Johnson. What's interesting, Dan, is Governor J.B. Pritzker was asked this week as to who he's going to support. And Pritzker said he wouldn't announce any support for either candidate, simply saying they need to really narrow in on their positions on crime, on education, on economic recovery, on bringing more jobs to Chicago. So whoever is going to be the next mayor of Chicago is definitely going to have a tall order to fill.
Agreed. Before we talk a little bit more about that, looking forward to the runoff on April 4th, let's just, you mentioned a couple of the key things that occurred during Lori Lightfoot's one term in office, and it will be one and done for Mayor Lightfoot. Of course, any leader during the COVID-19 pandemic has had huge challenges that they faced. Lightfoot erred on the side of strict lockdowns. I mean, she even had like vaccine passport mandates in place for anyone 5 and up who wanted to go to a restaurant in Chicago. Of course, Chicago schools, Lori Lightfoot did push back against the Chicago's Teachers Union, who wanted to carry the remote learning out much longer than most other school districts, both across Illinois and across the country did. Violent crime crime surged under her tenure. Do you think those issues played a role in her losing in the primary?
Yeah, I haven't seen any polling to really touch on that. What were the major issues that may have swayed one voter or the other? But you can't not think that it was all of these issues compounded on top of each other, made even more severe by the COVID-19 restrictions, the vaccine passports, the businesses that were hurt by the COVID restrictions. Then you've got the rioting that happened in the summer of 2020. You've got the handling of crime and urging police to, not pursue certain criminal suspects on foot, even, and then the juxtaposition of how the Cook County State's Attorney has been treating crime in Chicago. All of that surely bared down on voters, and the outcome was pretty resounding. Even though, yes, there were 9 different candidates, the fact that Lightfoot couldn't come into the top 2 spots speaks volumes as to how voters felt about Lightfoot's tenure.
Thanks, Greg, for that. Now let's look briefly ahead at the runoff. Paul Vallas, who was the top vote getter Tuesday, former Chicago Public Schools chief, ran heavily on the crime issue in Chicago, said he would bring reforms to policing in the city in an effort to reduce violent crime in the city. And until just a few weeks ago, Brandon Johnson was really a relatively unknown candidate. Of course, he is a Cook County commissioner. He has strong ties to the Chicago Teachers Union. Johnson had a pretty significant lead over Vallas in the primary, but Vallas now has about a month to get his message out there. Anything stand out that you think is going to decide this race?
Yeah, I think one thing that Brandon Johnson, some of the messaging I've seen him put out already is he's going to bring fresh new ideas, seeming to hint that Vallas is a little old school. So how old school politics or policy ideas that are characterized by Johnson, whether that plays out to the electorate, that'll be interesting to see. The idea of fresh new ideas versus old school policies. But you got to imagine that Vallas is likely going to counter that, pointing to maybe some education successes he had, maybe some other ideas that have worked elsewhere to curb crime, to address the economy. These are obviously going to be the next few weeks here, them narrowing down, not giving platitudes, but actually giving concise policy issues that they say that they'll bring to Chicago if indeed they were to secure the majority vote.
One of the criticisms already being leveled by critics against Johnson is his close association with the Chicago Teachers Union. Some feel the CTU already has too much power. Do you see Vallas using that as a campaign issue against Johnson?
Yeah, I think that'll be one of the kind of clear distinctions here. As I said, Johnson's putting out there the idea of new ideas versus maybe some old policies. But you've also got something of a dynamic developing of a managerial type of take versus a worker-based approach. Paul Vallas, being the former CEO of Chicago Public Schools, you got to imagine he's probably got a different perspective on how things can be managed and dealt with, how controversies can be managed and dealt with, how problems that may arise can be managed and dealt with, versus Johnson, who's a former teacher and very much being supported by the Chicago Teachers Union. Which message is really gonna ring true for voters? Is it going to be somebody who has that managerial type of take, or is it going to be somebody who is going to champion workers' rights, for instance? So these are obviously going to be some important policy issues and approaches that these candidates are going to have to spell out for voters.
Well, Chicago voters have just about a month to figure out who they want to vote for. Of course, early voting will begin in less than a month, but it's time now to get educated on where these two candidates stand, because one of them is going to be the next mayor for at least the next 4 years of Chicago. Moving on, Greg, we're less than 2 weeks away from the first trial related to the federal corruption probe into longtime former House Speaker Michael Madigan. Michael Madigan's trial is not starting in a couple of weeks, but some other key players in that case are set to stand trial, including some former ComEd officials ComEd, in a deferred prosecution agreement a couple of years ago, admitted to wrongdoing in relation to their relationship with Michael Madigan, and then a longtime Michael Madigan associate. They're scheduled to go on trial in a couple of weeks. Give us an update. What's going on here?
Yeah, and this is really, people have been waiting for this since 2020 when the deferred prosecution agreement was revealed, and we got a lot of detail in that document about public official A and Mike Madigan being public official A and all of the intricate details about how this nearly 10-year-long scheme to curry favor from the speaker and his allies in exchange for favorable legislation for one of Illinois' largest utilities. And before, we jump a little bit more into some of the detail there, one of the key players in this, John Lausch, he's retiring. He was the one that brought these charges against Madigan, against the various associates of Madigan and ComEd. He was central to bringing about this prosecution, but after being appointed by former President Trump and being kept on at the behest of U.S. Senator Dick Durbin by President Joe Biden, Lausch is hanging it up. He's going to be retiring, I believe, March 11th. So before we got into some of those details, wanted to definitely highlight that, because you wouldn't have a prosecution without prosecutors and the investigations that are ongoing. But with this, what's fascinating is, of course, you've got two different trials, one being of Madigan. That's not going to be until next year. But this one that's coming up deals with four individuals, one a Madigan confidant, Michael McClain, and then you've got two former ComEd officials and a lobbyist who is working on behalf of ComEd. And the allegations range from, bribes to wiretapping or wire fraud and a whole host of other allegations. What's interesting is how the defense is approaching some of the challenges they have in front of them, including the idea of having the various emails that might not be directly related with this story, but related to those who are charged in this case. In particular, one from Mike McClain from years ago, to some elected officials and others about making sure that controversial emails about a rape in Champaign don't get released. But you also have some pushback from the defense on having a political professor testify about the intricate workings of the Chicago political machine. And something that we've seen also in the Rod Blagojevich trial was whether or not certain types of what's considered log rolling, exchanging this for that in the legislative landscape, is that illegal conduct? So these are going to be some things the judge is going to have to determine moving forward with jury selection starting soon. But I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people wanting some popcorn in that courtroom as this case progresses.
And I should say the Center Square will be in the courtroom covering the trial as it goes on. One key piece of evidence in the case is the fact that ComEd, the former employer of two of the defendants in this specific case, agreed to pay $200 million after admitting that it participated in this corruption scheme. Defendants' attorneys also want to keep that piece of evidence out, but that seems to be a key part of the prosecutor's case here. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and this is kind of interesting too, because the deferred prosecution agreement, it's an agreement and it could be rescinded. And the agreement was that ComEd would not get prosecuted if they worked alongside of the feds to develop the case. So how this plays out could impact that deferred prosecution agreement. You're right. They had a $200 million fine, million with an M, that essentially signaled to everyone that ComEd was complicit in this, having some kind of culpability. So that deferred prosecution agreement will be an integral piece in this case, and I don't know how it can't be. So how this continues to be played out in the ongoing litigation, looking to see how this all comes together in the weeks ahead.
Of course, what happens in this trial that starts in a couple of weeks, of these two former ComEd high-ranking officials, the lobbyist and the Madigan confidant, what happens there could dramatically affect what happens in Madigan's trial himself next year. If prosecutors can't win convictions, for example, how does their case proceed against Madigan. So that's something to keep in mind as well. But Greg, let's move on. In addition to being, the Center Square's Illinois editor and senior Springfield reporter, you also seem to be like the gun ban challenge coverage czar. You've written a lot of stories about what's going on with the gun ban that Governor Pritzker enacted a little bit more than a month ago, and all of the legal challenges to it. What's the latest update here?
Yeah, so this is something that can get convoluted real quick. So hopefully I can kind of boil it down for people to understand the different paths that there are in challenging the gun ban that was enacted January 10th of this year. So we're only looking at 50 some odd days of this being in place. So you have two different tracks. One is in state courts challenging the law. Another's in federal courts. And starting with the state level challenges, Tom DeVore's attempt to get his 3 state level cases combined with a separate Macon County case, the Illinois Supreme Court declined that. They ruled against that motion. So DeVore, he's continuing on with his 3 cases consolidated. He's actually been putting in subpoena requests for legislators who voted for this, and even associations who may have been part of negotiations, including the Illinois Sheriff's Association. But I talked with the Illinois Sheriff's Association, and they are looking to quash that subpoena from DeVore, saying that, this is privileged communications, if there are any, that shouldn't be part of this. What's really interesting, though, is the Illinois Sheriff's Association opposes the gun ban. So in state courts, they're having to try to quash an attorney's request, the attorney who's trying to block this law. But in federal courts, the Illinois Sheriff's Association this week filed a amicus brief, and that's a friend of the court, from my understanding of legal terms in Latin. But they essentially say that the gun ban is a violation of the Second Amendment, and sheriffs across the state, as we've been reporting on, are not going to enforce this because they don't want to violate their citizens' Second Amendment rights. So last week, the Southern District of Illinois, they combined 4 cases. Those 4 cases coming from the National Shooting Sports Foundation, separate one from the Illinois State Rifle Association, a separate one from the Federal Firearms Licensees of Illinois, and a separate one out of Crawford County that was filed in state court but transferred to federal court. So we do have those cases consolidated. Today, Thursday, the state is set to reply to a motion for preliminary injunction. That's essentially a hold on the law while they work the constitutional questions out. And we also have a court date scheduled for that consolidated Southern District of Illinois federal case. All 4 cases are going to be heard April 12th in East St. Louis. So you could imagine that there's going to be a lot more legal wranglings both in the state and federal courts as you have challenges of the state's gun ban and how this is ultimately going to go all the way up the food chain, as the Southern District Federal Court judge said last week. And he fully anticipates that however this gets decided in the lower courts, it's going to go up on appeal and likely all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court.
We still could be months away from any finality to this. Is that, if it goes to the U.S. Supreme Court, maybe even longer than that?
I think some kind of preliminary injunction could be possible after that April hearing in the Southern District federal courts, and then that could be in place while it plays out. So there could be a hold on implementing or enforcing the law in place while it goes through the appellate court and goes through the U.S. Supreme Court.
Listeners can keep up with Greg's great reporting on this story and more at thecentersquare.com. But we're out of time this week. For Greg Bishop, I'm Dan McCaleb, and thank you for listening.